Hi, I'm Deanna Joe, and welcome to my channel, Responsible Faith. If you have not watched part 1 or part 2 of this, you probably need to go do that now because what we talk about today isn't going to make much sense to you. But today I have 2 survivors of the Madison Church in Wisconsin who both experienced sexual abuse cover-ups by their pastor, John Grant. And so we are going to talk about the reporting of John Grant for this to the United Pentecostal Church International, how they responded, how it all went down from there, and then the outcomes. So welcome, Debbie. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you.
So I was pretty much out of the loop once I sent my letter to David Bernard and stuff. And so there is the bulk of this happened in your guys's wheelhouse. Like this was not me from the point where I sent him the letter and then you guys decided to move forward with it with the local district. It was all on you guys. And so maybe I'll start with you, Debbie. David Bernard called you. Talk about that. How did you feel about that? I was the one who told him he should. Did I set that up in a bad way? Should I have not said that? How'd that go?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I was initially pretty skeptical that he wanted to talk to me because I had reached out to him previously and didn't really receive much of a response. I sent him a lot of documentation through Facebook because that was kind of the way that I knew to get a hold of him. And I didn't really get any kind of response. And so when he wanted to talk to me, I was skeptical. I was also really nervous. I have a lot of anxiety whenever I have to talk to anyone that's a part of the UPC. And so every time I have a conversation, and I think it's really important to talk about this because we're going to be talking about lots of conversations. And every time I have to have a conversation with somebody from the church, I'm dealing with days of anxiety before the conversation, days of anxiety after the conversation, like all sorts of physical symptoms. It is really, really difficult every time I put myself into this position. So I was a little bit reluctant because I knew that there's going to be a price to pay beyond just how difficult the phone call is. We had the phone call. It was a very long phone call, more than an hour. And he was very polite. He wanted to hear my whole story. He wanted to know everything that happened to me. He asked me a lot of questions. And I didn't really struggle to give him answers because I'm pretty much an open book. Like everything, I write about it, I talk about it. It's out there. So it wasn't like I was revealing anything that wasn't kind of available. And you know, it's kind of like a nesting doll of awfulness because I talked to him, which, then he wanted me to talk to Lisa Reddy, and it just kind of started to grow from that initial phone call. Rebecca and I both had some correspondence with him over email, which started out pleasant, but as soon as we kind of gave any pushback at all, it started to become combative and a little bit unpleasant. And it was one of those things where when the initial phone call happened, he was very pleasant and very polite. But as the email exchanges started to fly back and forth, that Pentecostal UPC person that I'm afraid of started to come out in his tone and his demeanor, especially towards Rebecca. So I was a little bit concerned and thinking, if these emails are going this way, what is going to happen if I actually file a complaint? I was reluctant to file a complaint with the Wisconsin district for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I have no faith in the UPCI organization, and I especially have no faith in the Wisconsin district that they're going to do anything.
Right.
But also, just like, again, I had a lot of concerns about my own mental health and my own ability to handle these interactions, because as someone who has complex PTSD, there's very real consequences for me every time I go into the ring with these people.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I made the decision to do it because I felt like I needed to cross every T and dot every I and make sure that I have done everything within my power to help to create a safe environment within that church. Mm-hmm. So like, I can't get the church shut down. I can't maybe change the hearts of everybody that's in the UPC, but I needed to do whatever I could do to help the people that are in my area, which is the Madison Church. Right. And I felt like it was really important to try to get some justice, because I felt like if John Grant, like, for instance, lost his license, that would send a really dramatic message throughout the entire Wisconsin district and maybe create a safer environment for children that are there now.
Yes.
So that's my long answer.
No, I mean, that's great. And so how about you, Rebecca, in the email exchanges, how did you feel about that? How did you feel it went? Did you feel like he pushed back on you too?
So I never actually talked to Bernard.
Right.
When I had gotten the initial contact from Debbie, people who wanted to meet with the UPC representatives at the hotel, I talked to Keith mainly on that. I think the last name was Fletcher, but I don't recall. So I went and met with them, spent 2 hours with the 4 individuals, all ministers of the UPCI, that kind of basically claimed they had no direct dealing with the Wisconsin, I don't know what you call it, leadership or board or whatever, so that they kind of were neutral representatives of UPC.
And all men, to be clear.
I never was contacted by Lisa Reddy.
Okay.
I'm not sure why. So when I had talked to Keith, he said, you do have to send your official complaint to Booker before we can meet with you. Well, by that time it was 3 days ahead, and they said their policy was that you handwrite a letter. And I was like, well, he's not going to get it before you guys are in town. I mean, we got notification on a Friday that they were going to be in town on a Monday or something like that. Yeah. And, I'm a mom, I have a job. I can't always just drop everything and go. So I was really trying to I have to make this meeting because it's the only time they're going to be in town. So Keith said, okay, send an email. And he said, if you would like, you can sign your name at the bottom of the email in a different font so it looks like you signed it. And I was like, that's silly. Everybody accepts email as legitimate correspondence these days.
Yeah.
So I went and met with them, sat for 4 hours or 2 hours, told my story, and never heard anything. Crickets. I noticed that Debbie got a letter, Anderson's got a letter, a bunch of people got a letter from the district or whatever saying this is what we decided. I never heard anything.
That's kind of crazy too, though, because I sent my letter, I resent it to Jim Booker, and he even email responded to me, someone who's not a victim. I mean, I don't even live in the country. Right. He responded to me to tell me that I'm pretty sure in the email he told me that they were going to move forward with an investigation. So they didn't even tell you that much.
I got nothing, crickets. So I sent Keith an email and I was like, hey, I came and sat with you guys for 2 hours, told my story. I was like, which obviously is legit because we went to court, we went to trial, my perpetrator was convicted. So I feel like I have a little bit of, I have some credence.
Yes.
And he sent me back and he's like, well, you didn't send a handwritten letter to Booker. So Booker is basically not considering your complaint. And I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
I was like, an email is legitimate correspondence. You said I could send an email. And I was like, I was like, this is just exactly what I expected from you guys.
Yeah.
I was like, my complaint was legitimate. I sat there for 2 hours with you. We've gone to trial. And so I sent him a scathing email and I was like, hey, I find this highly insulting that I came. I poured out my heart to you. You knew we went to trial. And because I didn't handwrite a letter, which you initially said was okay in an email, I don't deserve any correspondence back from you. He forwarded it to Booker. I still to this day have heard nothing.
That's crazy.
So I was like, I mean, everyone else got a letter. And I feel like this is exactly what I expected. The one comment I did get back was that, because I said, did anyone ever get the court transcripts? Because John Grant admitted in court and to the detective that Glenn had admitted to having sex with me when I was underage. And so I wanted these leaders to read the court transcripts of, especially when John Grant was on the stand. Because I was like, I mean, he admitted on the stand that he knew. He admitted that he intentionally tries to keep young people marrying within the congregation, not just within UPC, because it keeps the money in-house. I mean, it was shocking. I felt like maybe he wasn't really understanding kind of what he was saying, because at one point in time, he looked at the DA and said, am I on trial here? And so I was like, you guys need to read his statements.
Yeah.
Which they came back and said UPC can't afford the transcripts.
Yeah.
Okay.
I bet you they didn't even get to it.
They didn't. I'm sure that they didn't even try. I honestly don't even think that they tried.
No.
And I feel like this is exactly what happens. You've got evidence sitting in front of you, and UPC is going to avoid. And because it wasn't a handwritten letter, they disregarded my complaint.
That's ridiculous.
And I was like, but you said, I have an email saying it was okay.
I just wanted to clarify that when I was at first talking about our exchange with Bernard, those exchanges were emails. So the exchanges that Rebecca and I had with David Bernard were email exchanges. They weren't phone calls. I was the only one, I think, that he actually talked to on the phone.
Just the whole process of it, I feel like, was just filled with BS. UPC can't afford the court transcripts. David Bernard claiming that basically his position is a figurehead and he has no real leadership power to come and even deal with anything.
I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I also am unclear about why Lisa Reddy did not reach out to the other survivors. She consistently told me that they could call her, and I did provide her information in the survivor group. But she also, if she had asked for it, would have had access to Rebecca's information because the Wisconsin district had it. She would have had access to Laura's information and John Eckenrod's information because the district had it. So if she really wanted to reach out to these people, she could have. But the way that it was dealt with was, I'm going to give this to you. You get them to call me, rather than, her reaching out and saying, hey, we're concerned. We'd like to speak with you about this. So I don't really understand that completely either.
I never called her because I kind of figured, like, what is she going to do for me? Which in hindsight, she has done nothing.
Well, so my experience was when David Bernard first mentioned me talking to her, he couched it as, this is a new initiative that we're trying to put into place to deal with all of these cases of inappropriate sexual behavior, especially with minors. And this is the person who's running this for us, who's in charge of this for us. Would you be willing to talk to her? She would like to talk to you about your experiences. So when I first started corresponding with her, I did not really see her as trying to help me through the process. I saw her as, she's the head of this thing, and he would like me to share my story with her because she's trying to work with survivors within the organization. So that was sort of how our dialogue started. I told her my story. She's like, yeah, I've read your whole blog. I was really touched by it. I want to apologize. I'm so sorry this happened to you. And she was very gracious. over time, I felt like our relationship kind of morphed, and I was a little bit unsure of what her actual role was. And I think that I don't think they were setting out to be deceptive or anything. I think it was just kind of sloppy. It just wasn't communicated well. It just became more than what I was expecting it to be. The other thing, though, is that I think that the Wisconsin district has a special hatred for Rebecca and myself in particular.
I mean, I can't say it's unwarranted.
And I think that that's part of the reason why she didn't get a letter, why she never got a response, even when she asked Jim Booker about why she didn't get a response. Jim Booker would not respond to me.
Okay.
When I tried to communicate with him about, like, where are we in the process? How much longer do you think it will be? The only response he was really willing to give me was to say, we're following all of the procedures.
Well, obviously.
I said, okay, that's
Right.
great. I'm glad you're doing that. But could you give me some sort of timeline so I could communicate that to the other survivors? And he just did not respond to me.
Mhm.
He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. But I feel like because Rebecca and I have the most clear-cut, undeniable case that our cases were covered up, that our abusers were promoted within the organization, I think that that is why they have a special, real strong dislike for us. And because they see me, I mean, this has been made very clear to me that they see me as the pot stirrer that, like, made all of this happen. And I'm like, well, no, I think the pot stirrer is the man who decided to molest me when I was 11 years old.
Yeah.
I'm not the one stirring the pot. He stirred the pot. I'm just, talking about it.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a special dislike set aside for Rebecca and myself. And I think that that's why they're playing these games, these semantic games with Rebecca regarding sending her a letter or giving her any kind of notification.
Well, I think you and I talked out loud.
Yeah.
And of course, now we are looked at in their organization as rebellious. We're reprobates, because I did get called that. And I feel like this is the only way that they can still kind of feel like they're exerting any power over us, is to basically just jerk us around. And I also kind of feel like, I'm sorry, but their judicial, they keep referring to the UPC judicial process. These processes were written by these guys themselves. So that they're never going to be like, let's do something that creates transparency. It's always going to be, the weird words and the semantics and loopholes so that they never have to answer for it. I mean, I feel like UPC on a whole, especially with the men, there's no amount of self-responsibility ever.
Right.
It is all, I mean, if you look at every single teaching that they have, it's always kind of boils down to the women, whether it be standards or, behavior or lusting, or every time a man sins, it's the woman's fault. And so I feel like they just set up these I keep doing this because I feel like it's just ridiculous. These judicial processes with loopholes. I mean, I'm sorry, but when they told me that I could sign my email in a different font because then it looks like I signed it, I'm like, I can go to the bank. I can go anywhere in like the entire world, and an email counts. You don't change the font for a signature. Who does that? It's just little things like that. I feel like we just got jacked around, and that's exactly what I expected.
Do you think part of the reason that maybe they not so happy with you, Rebecca, especially, is because you just blew the story wide open by taking your abuser to court, and charges were pressed, and the whole thing was, the media, the news media covered this was a whole big thing. I mean, I think once it hits a criminal trial, then it's very difficult for anybody to deny.
Oh, for sure. I'm sure. I mean, I wasn't the submissive, passive little women that they like in UPC.
Well, and she also was the reason why John Grant had to go in and testify.
Right.
Okay.
Oh,
And
and
I
other
really,
thing-
really wish that they would have gotten the transcripts, because I feel like if they would have heard some of the things I wish his congregation could hear what he said on the stand, because I think it would blow some of their minds as well.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, some of
I
them were
honestly kind
there.
of was like, I'm really surprised he's admitting to some of this, but he did.
I think
But yeah,
the other thing that we definitely need to talk about is the transcripts, because when I went in for my interview, when I was sitting with Keith Fletcher and the other men, I specifically requested, when I spoke to Keith, I believe I spoke to him on the phone, but it might have been over email. I specifically requested that they get the transcripts, and I was told that they could not afford them, that it would be thousands of dollars, that there was no money for that. But if I wanted to get the transcripts and provide them the transcripts, that they would look at them.
right. I told them to get the transcripts as well. I was like, you guys really, really need to request this. The whole I don't have money, for one, it's not thousands of dollars. So I feel like they didn't even try. And even if it was thousands of dollars, UPC can afford it.
Well, they can afford it. And for a group that is so hyper holiness focused, would you not want to know if one of your ministers, what they had to say on the stand of a situation like this? I mean, I feel like all they talk about is holiness. Well,
but I think the nature of UPC is obviously very cultish. And I think if they started investigating all of these complaints, for one, that would just go, I mean, it would be like the Catholic Church, it would be everywhere. And it would make them look bad, which ultimately we all know is their thing. And I think they don't want it. They want it hidden, because honestly, so many, and I truly, especially after hearing so many people come forward, after we came forward, we get contacted by everybody. It's rampant in UPC. And I do feel like, because it is such a tight-knit culture and people are okay with it, nobody really wants that to change. People are drawn there because it is allowed. I mean, and I know Debbie and I have talked about this before, like when you find out that it's okay for these older men to have sex with younger girls, a lot of these older men are going to come there because of that. I mean, I know that one of the reasons why she left UPC is because she was sitting in church and heard a group of guys talking about how many virgins they had slept with and who they had their eyes on in the congregation. I mean, it was accepted behavior. In my situation, everyone just kind of accepted that I was being dated by this older man as an underage girl. It wasn't even questioned. And in my mind at the time too, it happened everywhere. So it's like I almost didn't even realize it was wrong. They don't want to change this culture. Are you kidding? UPC is a free for all for men.
so
Why would they want to change?
Do you think this culture still exists in the
absolutely.
church? Oh yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. I feel like, and Debbie, I think probably feels the same, because we've talked about it before. Like, I spent my whole childhood and my whole young adult years feeling like I had to conform to what everybody wanted me to think and be who they wanted me to be and never rock the boat.
Yeah.
And I hate that phrase, because I feel like that's what I was literally told so many times, that now, getting a little older, and probably age has a little bit to do with it too. You just kind of feel like, I'm done. I am done playing the games. I am done putting up with it. I am done pussyfooting around. And not that I want to be mean, obviously, but sometimes the truth hurts, and it's not, if that hurts you, then I'm sorry. Like, if you wanted me to paint you in a better picture, then you should have maybe behaved a little bit better.
Yeah.
No, and it's not like I'm out. Right. It's not like you're out to be mean, but I also feel like for years and years and years, when you're pushed down and then you just are tired of it and you're like, no more.
Well, and we've all crossed that 40 years old threshold, have we not? And there is something that happens to a woman when she turns 40 that she's just like, okay, you people.
Yeah. I'm just done. I've burned enough bridges. I'm not afraid of it anymore.
Yeah.
I really honestly think, though, that if all of this stuff with Glenn had happened to a different survivor, he would have never gone to jail. Like, I feel like Rebecca's anger and tenacity is what pushed it across the line.
Mhm.
And like, I think that we wouldn't have even had that win if it had been, somebody else. Like, I just don't think that would have ever happened. Some of our bravery is fueled by rage.
Yeah, for sure.
It's really
Oh, I
true
mean,
though.
how many times do they ask you, like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And, you feel like your diplomatic answer, and which, I mean, there is truth to it. Like, I want this to stop. This needs to be
Mhm.
seen. This needs to be noticed. This behavior needs to stop. I guarantee it's continuing because the same people
Yeah.
that were there
Yeah.
when I was there are still there. You can't, this creating change from the inside. I feel like you can't create change when there's already dirt there. Like, you need to just wash the laundry and start with some fresh stuff. And I do feel like, and I admit it, I was like, part of it is just anger. I
Mhm.
lost my childhood. I lost my years in my 20s.
Yeah.
And it's really hard when you're like me, I'm 53 and I'm in therapy. And I'm seeing how all the things that I struggle with now are directly related to that.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is, going through Safe Church and going through all of this is not going to heal all of the other stuff.
No.
It's not going to deal with all of the other trauma that I feel because of the church.
No, for sure.
Just like one little thing. I've asked myself a number of times why no one else tried to do anything when I was a teen, because, Steve left and I was 12 or 13 years old, and I wasn't really approached by, not seriously. I mean, there was always creepiness and weirdness around me, but like, I wasn't seriously approached by anyone. And I honestly think it's because I told.
Right.
I think they learned because I was one of the earliest, except for maybe Dina, I was one of the earliest victims. I told, and in their eyes, I ruined a man's life.
Yeah.
And so they're not going to touch me with a 10-foot pole, right? Because I'm a talker, because I went to the pastor and I told. But I think the other lesson that they learned from me was like, oh, so if I do this and I get caught, the worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'm going to get sent to another church for a little while.
So the risk is worth it.
The risk is worth it because I'm not really going to be punished. And all of these young men who went on to abuse this generation of girls that was younger than me, they were all around watching what happened with Steve. They were all around watching what happened with Glenn and Dina and seeing nobody's going to say anything. Nobody's going to do anything.
It's empowering.
So it created an environment where anything goes. And I believe that not getting the transcripts was strategic.
If they don't read it, they can't admit to knowing.
Well,
I have heard from everyone that Jim Booker is this really wonderful man. He's very compassionate. He's on our side. He wants nothing but the best for us. He wants us to get healing, and he wants there to be justice. I don't know if I really fully buy that, because
I completely don't.
What I'm also hearing is you should feel bad for Jim Booker because he's in such a precarious situation. There are people in the district that are mad at him. He might lose his position.
Like, we are supposed to be pitying him because he's stuck in the middle. I don't believe it for a minute, because I think if he really cared and he felt compassion to the victims, I would have gotten a response. The fact that nothing, like, I've heard nothing, even when I have emailed him again and been like, I find this insulting, nothing. If he really cared, he would have been like, I'm super sorry. The fact that John Grant got on the stand and admitting to knowing this was happening with not just me, but other, Glenn and Dina and Glenn and me, but I mean, admitting it, and they still are like, really tells you. That's why I say, like, I don't think they ever intended on doing anything. I think this was all so that when questioned, they can come back and say, well, we tried, we did something. but I feel like there were so many comments about them being sued that I think that's the only reason why they sat with us, is because they're afraid there's going to be legal action against the district.
Well, I also believe that so my conversations with Lisa Reddy from the very start, she was very upfront with me. She said, I don't think there's any universe in which they're going to pull his license.
Yeah.
John Grant getting his license pulled was the only reason I did this. I don't give two hoots about the Hall of Faith. It means nothing to me.
I never even heard of the Hall of Faith until now.
I wanted his license. And I'll tell you the thing that I am really upset about is what they're saying is, well, he doesn't really preach anymore and he doesn't really teach anymore. So, do we really need to take his license? And my attitude is, well, if he's not preaching or teaching, why does he need a license?
Right.
And, so this attitude of like, well, I've been told he's old. I've been told he's frail. I've been told he's going to die soon. Do we really want to do this to him? I'm sorry, but I sat through that court trial and I saw the looks on all of the survivors' faces when they knew that John Grant was going to be in that courtroom. These are grown people. Some of the people are older than me, and I'm 53 years old. And there was fear. Yeah. There was stress and anxiety because he has been instrumental in wrecking the lives of so many people and causing so much trauma and so much stress and so much fear that these grown people were afraid of this frail old man that they keep saying has no power and nobody needs to worry about. When they were going to wheel him into the trial space, everyone was on pins and needles and scared. And so that tells me right there that he still has power, at least in the minds of the survivors, and that, he's done a lot of damage. Rebecca and I were there. I mean, Rebecca
I didn't get to see him because I was still in.
No, I was with you.
Right. But I was kind of like
we knew because we had all the survivors checking in with us before and after they went into court. But I watched Rebecca give her testimony, and I can tell you that it was crushing. It wasn't just crushing to her. It was crushing to me. It was crushing to all of us. We were all crushed by that. And woman after woman after woman got up on that stand and talked about the culture of that church, talked about John Grant's role in the culture of that church, talked about their own abuse, the people who had hurt them. And if they had gotten those transcripts, they would have been able to hear not just from John Grant and from Rebecca, but from all of the witnesses who testified to John Grant's role in the orchestration of this environment where all of this stuff was able to happen. And I think that they didn't get the transcripts because they didn't want the information.
Exactly. That's what I say. If they never get the transcripts, they can always claim that they didn't know. So they're just going to lie about, we couldn't get them, they cost too much money, blah, 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 so that they don't have to know. They don't have to read it, because if they find out and they read it, then they're going to feel like they have to do something. Now they can just claim, well, we never knew.
Well, and I also had this pointed out to me when I was speaking with Dana from the Rape Crisis Center here in Dane County. And one of the things she said is, had they cared, had the Wisconsin district cared, they would have been at Glenn's trial.
True.
They would have been at that. Somebody from the district would have been at that trial every single day, watching the survivors, watching John Grant, watching the whole thing and reporting back to the district. Because, it was in the media. It wasn't like it wasn't. I don't believe for a minute.
They all knew about it because they were mouthing in the pulpit at the Madison Church the week that it happened in the midweek service. So, they knew about it.
Yeah. Well, right. And there were a few church people that did show up. More people from the church showed up for the sentencing than they actually did for the trial. Again, because then they can just they can state that they just didn't know.
Yeah.
And that
However,
was shocking too, because like we had to walk into the courtroom and we had to walk through all of those UPC people. And what was really, it was really just like a shot to the heart, right? Because like I'm seeing my Sunday school teacher from when I'm 7 years old standing on the side of Glenn Uselman. It's horrifying.
and you ask, like, do we think that this culture still exists in UPC? A bazillion times over, I cannot stress. I mean, for one, if you look at all the current court cases that are happening right now, um, with UPC ministers nationwide, it's undeniable. And two, yes, walking through that group of people at the sentencing, I saw a couple there that one of them had been my teacher for years. I grew up, I considered her and her family some of my closest friends there. When I left the church, she quit taking my calls. And when I walked by them, the husband looked up at me and said, "Oh my." And I just ignored it. I was hyper focused. But then later on, they told someone who then reported back to me, they said they know Glenn was guilty, but they'll still support him because he's UPC. And I was like, I considered myself a good friend. Like we vacationed with these people. We did other, and the culture still is we're going to support him, even though we know he's guilty because he's UPC. We refuse to support anyone who's not UPC. And I feel
one
like
of us.
exactly. And I'm like, you showed up and sat behind him in the courtroom and supported him. And the only comment you made to me was, "Oh my." Like, I'm not UPC anymore. So therefore I deserve, and so I feel like if that right there doesn't reaffirm that that culture still exists,
Yeah.
then nothing will. It
Like it was such an interesting thing, because at the sentencing there was, the UPC people on one side, and then on the other side is like, well, there's your generation of discarded girls.
mm-hmm.
And the fact that, that the Wisconsin district wants us to believe that they care about justice and they're going to like take on the case of any woman who files a complaint, and they're going to take it seriously and they're going to do everything that they can, when just last summer we're witnessing this, which says to me that the Wisconsin or the Madison church is exactly the same as it was when
Right.
we were.
Well, and I feel like one of the worst perpetrators with harassing young women is now the pastor there. Nothing has changed. These same people that were there when I was there are still in leadership. Nothing has changed. It's
And the safe
it's disheartening for one, but I also am absolutely not surprised.
The safe church process is really not set up to accommodate survivors. So when I went in and they interviewed me,
You mean the judicial process?
yes, when I went in for the judicial process and I was interviewed by the people who Jim Booker had handpicked for that process, that part of the
Because
process.
I guess I should make it clear that he, as the district superintendent, he recused himself from the investigation part because he is good friends with John Grant. And so he appointed this Keith Fletcher to oversee the investigation. And then was it 3 other men?
I think so, yeah.
4 men. I believe Keith, said oh gosh, I don't want to be wrong on this. There's 4 men. One man said that he actually is part of the Wisconsin district, but he's relatively new. So he doesn't really he never sat, I believe, under John Grant as superintendent. The other ones were from kind of like surrounding areas outside of Wisconsin, was the impression I got, because they all did really, really reinforce that they don't have ties to the leadership here.
Yeah.
So they were considered kind of neutral individuals, which is great. But I also feel like I also know how UPC protects their own.
Yeah.
And my understanding was that they were all new transplants to the state. So like they're currently here, but they don't know anything about John Grant or his history or his leadership.
I just know that they all really reinforce that they're not directly involved, or at least it was at that time. So like Grant doesn't have to pull over them.
Were they clear when they contacted you guys as to what you could do? Like, you could bring a support person, you couldn't bring a support person.
Well, I'm pretty sure that I spoke to Keith Fletcher on the phone. And when I talked to him, he was like, we're going to be in town like this one afternoon and then the morning of the next day. And so we'd like to talk to you. When do you want to come? In the evening or in the morning? There was no like,
really
does
short.
this work for you? Can
Yeah.
you do this? I was not given any information about having a support person. They were just like, this is where it is. You can come. And I actually reached out to Lisa Reddy and said they did not give me any information about whether or not I should have a support person. I could have a support person. And I said, actually, after talking to Dana from the Rape Crisis Center, one of the things she said is that probably should have some kind of mental health professional available because you are a trauma survivor and you're going to be talking about some like really heavy stuff. And there was no communication with me at all about that. So there was no way that even if they had said you can't bring a support person, there is no way that I would have gone into that room by myself.
No.
I don't even think, in hindsight, I don't even think that they contacted me. You sent me something, Debbie, saying, oh, hey, FYI, they're in town. If you want to get a hold of them, here's the guy's email. And I emailed him and said, if you're coming to town, I would like to meet. When are you here?
Well,
and I had to go I think I went at like 7:00 at night or something ridiculous. Cause I'm like, the
You
only
went right
time
after
they gave me was when I was at work.
Yeah.
And so this is one thing that I have noticed about this whole process is they seem to think that I'm like the nice church lady. So they tell me everything. And then I'm supposed to disperse the information to everyone rather than like reaching out to people and saying, we'd like to talk to you. This is when you can come. They're like, oh, why don't you tell everybody all of this information and get this all set up for us? And like have people, you know,
you were like their secretary.
Yeah, and it was just like,
fine.
I am, in fact.
Funny, they all avoid talking to me.
That was one of the things, though, that I wanted to make sure that I touched on. When I went in to talk to them, it was very clear to me that they are not trauma informed. They do not understand. They were trying very hard. They kept offering me water. They were like being very nice to me, even though, you know, there was a lot of like crosstalk and like kind of arguing about, well, what should we ask her? What can we ask her? That kind of thing. But it was very clear to me that they weren't trauma informed. And I think that this whole process could use some trauma informed training, because the way that I walked away from it was, okay, so I had to tell them that I thought they should get the transcripts. Then they were like, well, if you want to get the transcripts, you could get the transcripts. And I'm like, as a survivor, that burden should not belong to me. That burden should belong to you. Then they're like, oh, could you reach out to all of these survivors and help them schedule a time to do this? Or could you get all of these survivors to write letters or whatever? And they're always asking me as the survivor to shoulder what I feel like should be their load. They could at the Wisconsin district level, because whether they know it or not, we watch all of their Facebook pages that they haven't blocked, which they've blocked Rebecca and I off a lot of stuff.
I'm totally blocked.
But they could put something out on the Wisconsin district page and say, if you are a survivor of one of the Wisconsin district churches, here is where, or anywhere, here is where you can contact us. But instead, it's like, oh, you survivor person who's contacted us, can you please tell everybody that they should do thus and such and thus and such, and arrange for them to talk to us and give, you know, have them call us. And it's like, well, why don't you call them? Like, I'm not your secretary. And so that part of the process I found to be really burdensome, and it added to my stress. And there were a lot of times when I couldn't process my own stress and my own anxiety because I was trying to corral survivors, and that just made everything harder. They don't seem to understand, no matter how many times I explain it to them, that our survivor community is still a little bit afraid of Calvary Gospel and afraid of Pastor Grant. And there are a lot of survivors, probably the vast majority of them, don't step forward because of that.
For sure.
Because of that. They have no belief that anything is going to happen. So why go through the process? And this judicial procedure just proved what they already believe.
Right.
So I went and sat with these men. So first of all, I had a very long conversation with David Bernard. I had a 3-hour conversation with Lisa Reddy. I had a very long conversation with Jim Booker. Then I had to write out everything that happened to me as part of my complaint. And then I was asked to do it again. So I had to write it out a second time because the first time I was told I could just send it in an email, which I did. And then I was told, no, you have to send a letter.
Right.
So,
and that's on top of the letter that you just hand wrote and mailed to me.
And that wasn't good.
With
Right.
my submissions. That's actually the third
time. So 3 times doing that. Then I had to go and sit and tell them the details of this really horrible thing that happened to me. During that time, I disclosed to them about other people who are currently in positions of authority within Calvary Gospel who I know for a fact are either predators or engaged in really sexually inappropriate behavior.
Yeah.
And what I was told is, well, we can't do anything unless the survivor steps forward and complains. And it's like, really? Really? Because you could, as the district superintendent, go into that church and say, I want to speak to your congregation. I want to speak to them about what is and is not appropriate behavior and what the Wisconsin district believes should and shouldn't be happening within its congregations. Jim Booker could go on a speaking tour throughout the entire state because let's be honest, the state of Wisconsin has some really heavy stuff happening right now. But they're just like, well, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do unless a survivor will come forward. And
well,
then
survivors came forward.
Well, it wasn't enough though, was it?
And it wasn't enough.
So then
I will say, go ahead.
So then I said to them, well, the reason that they won't come forward is because they're afraid of John Grant and they're afraid of the retribution coming from Calvary Gospel. And every time I express that to someone, they look at me like I'm crazy.
Yeah.
And I said, well, if it was just me, then maybe I would look at it and say, okay, Debbie, maybe you're being unreasonable. But we were all afraid when we were at court. And we have all collectively talked about being worried about what kind of revenge they're going to take on us when we speak. I don't think that comes from nowhere. We were conditioned as children to fear the leadership and especially the men in the church. And so it's trauma that we have, and we haven't been able to, release it completely. So rather than saying, wow, these women are really traumatized, something obviously happened here. Let's go into this church. Let's go alongside this pastor. Let's have some serious conversations. Let's maybe speak to the congregation. Their attitude is like, bring us more survivors.
I think too, on the note of fear, like, I feel like I'm not afraid of John Grant. I'm not afraid of any, I would love to sit down and have some conversations with some of these people. However, I will say that I was very afraid of physical retribution. I remember, Glenn, when there was someone he didn't like, there was one specific family member he didn't like, he would pray that God would kill them. And I feel like now looking back, it's a little psycho. But I did kind of feel like I would absolutely, hands down, not be surprised if I went after John Grant and someone from the congregation came after me, because I know that that's how much that they're just brainwashed. To them, going after John Grant is worse than going after God himself. And so, I was a little nervous. There were a few times, and Debbie was with me, we had a detective walk us to our car. We had people go with us. on the flip side, I do feel like when I did meet with those 4 gentlemen, I felt like I was treated very respectfully. They were very apologetic. In fact, when I walked in, they said, "Do you want to leave the door open? Would you feel more comfortable?" We were in a conference room way down at the end of a hallway in a hotel, so there wasn't really thorough traffic. And, they did ask, "Do you want to keep the door open? Would you be more comfortable telling your story with it closed?" So I felt like they were trying within the very limited knowledge that they had. I did when I left, I felt like that went a lot better than I expected. I do feel like to a certain degree, um, they were also figureheads. Those 4 gentlemen could have been like hands down giving recommendations that when they did take it to leadership in the Wisconsin district, it wasn't going to go anywhere. I did feel like they were sincere. I mean, obviously they're always going to try to protect their own, but they weren't, by any means grotesque about it. I think to a certain degree, they were probably put in that position that none of those 4 gentlemen wanted to be put in. And I guarantee it probably did not do good things for their ministry either.
Yeah,
So
they were horrified. I mean, I could tell they were
right.
horrified.
I did feel like it went really, really well, but I also feel like, again, it was pointless. It was pointless for them to waste their time to come and sit and talk with us because it wouldn't matter what their recommendations were. No one was actually going to do it once they took it to someone who had any authority. And it was a waste of our time. Now, I'm always going to do it. If someone wants to chat and I can help, especially the UPC, you want to sit down with me, I will come sit down with you. However, I had no hope it was going to go anywhere. And I think, like Debbie said, this just kind of compounded it. Like these guys were, essentially cannon fodder. And I'm sure it didn't go well with their ministries either because they had to investigate one of their own. But
right. And they were trying, they were trying very hard to be measured, to be careful. The one thing though that I struggled with personally was I was giving them a lot of information. I was like, look, I've got you here. This opportunity is never, ever going to happen again. So I'm going to tell you about every case I can think of off the top.
I did the same.
I'm like, and there's more. I'm like, there is more. The only ones I told them about were the people who have actually talked in the survivor group or talked to us, like Rebecca and I, about it. I've had so many people send me Facebook messages, send me emails, call me on the phone. It's like the most overwhelming thing. But I'm like, I'm going to tell them, you've got people in leadership. I have my own personal story with the pastor that they have now. Let me tell you about this. And for their response to be like, well, bring us more survivors, it felt callous. And it felt like, oh, so you don't really want to know.
Oh, absolutely.
And it was very much like their crosstalk was very much like, can we listen to this? Should we be talking about this? Is this outside the scope of what we're supposed to be here to listen to? Like there was a lot of like trying to figure out whether they should engage with me or not. And it just felt sanitary and it felt like they weren't really there with an open heart to hear everything that I had to say.
I also feel like, Debbie, you told your story, which in and of itself should have been enough. However, like with the story going in and saying, John Grant admitted, I have evidence from, the investigation, from the police records. He said it on the stand. He knew Glenn admitted to having sex with me when I was underage. He knew about the relationship with Dina because they had gotten pulled into his office. He knew that they didn't need to know anymore. They didn't even need to interview anyone else. They didn't need anyone else's story. That right there is enough that she'd have been like, you had a pastor who knew this gentleman was having sex with underage girls. And when it was all said and done, you told the girls to shut their yaps and you promoted him. That's all they needed to know. They didn't need any more.
Had they gotten the transcripts, they wouldn't have even need to speak with us.
Right. Like they didn't need
could have been
more
saved the trauma of that.
Did you guys feel like when you went into the interview though, did you feel like the men in the interview believed you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Debbie, when you talked to Lisa Reddy and David Bernard, do you feel like they believed you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never felt from anyone, Jim Booker, anyone, that they didn't believe me.
Oh, I have a beef with Jim Booker.
But let me tell you this. Okay. I felt like they believed me, but their belief in my story wasn't enough.
Yeah.
I feel
And
like to a certain degree, they just want to know details so they know exactly what they have to do to cover it up. You know, these guys, I don't think in any way didn't believe us. I think probably some of them, maybe a few of them, actually are completely aware that this stuff goes on. But all we're doing is giving them evidence or giving them, you know, more stories so that they know better how to cover it up. You know,
yeah,
like, well, they got caught doing this, what should we do next time? Because, you know, if they can, if they can say, if they can deny knowing anything about it, you know, it's plausible deniability. They can't be held accountable for things that they don't know.
I do think that there is a little bit of not wanting to believe the truth about their organization happening with
I think
both David Bernard and Lisa Reddy, because in my conversations with them, what I keep hearing is, well, Wisconsin is especially bad. Wisconsin is a cesspool. We know Wisconsin is a problem. Wisconsin, 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 Wisconsin. And it's like, but that doesn't wash, because I'm getting letters, I'm getting emails from people from all over the US. This is not just a Wisconsin problem.
yeah.
I think that there's just this desire to deny the severity of what's happening within the organization.
I think if they had to admit, you know, if they had to actually accept in their head that they've kind of created this monster, then they have to reevaluate
Their
their complete
teachings.
life beliefs. These people have centered their entire life on this religious belief system.
Yeah.
And if they had to accept, like, we created a monster in this system, then they have to go back and be like, what else could we have been wrong about? And then, you know, poof, everything that they've believed in their whole entire life has just now gone up in flames. And most people don't have the gumption to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest thing of like, oh, well, you know, this goes back to the couple saying, we know he's guilty, but God has forgiven him. If they if they had to actually assess it and be like, we really need to support the victim, even though she's not UPC, they're going to have to start assessing enormous amounts of other of their, you know, aspects of their belief system. And they're not going to do that, especially in UPC when your entire life is encased in that culture. How do you walk away? You know, how do you say, I have invested all this time and all this money and 50 years of my life into this culture and it might be wrong? Denying it is easier psychologically.
I have a tremendous amount of empathy and understanding for people who are in ministry, who are finding out about these things and are faced with the choice of, do they stay or do they go? But I have empathy, but I expect them to make the right choice. I had to make that choice.
Mm-hmm.
I had to decide for my own self-preservation that I needed to leave. It wasn't easy for me. I didn't have a support system. And so while I understand that you might lose your livelihood and you might lose your position and all your friends and everything, yes, so did I.
Right.
I did too. And I lost everything because of something that was done to me that I had no control over, that caused my whole teen years and everything to spiral out of control. So like, I expect these are adults. I expect them to do the right thing. I expect them to do what anyone would do. I think that they hold themselves to this standard that they're better than everyone in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
They're not. And, you know, and so I'm sorry if it means that you have to lose your community, but if you see all of this, and I think the higher up you go in the organization, the more you see, right? Because you see everything. If you see everything, if you're not willing to make a stand because you're worried about losing your position, you're worried about being voted out of office, you're worried about losing your church, I have a real problem with that.
I think
That
for,
feels like hypocrisy to me.
yeah, I think for a religious organization that touts their superiority, that they are God's chosen few, and lying is a sin, and honesty and transparency and living a wholesome Christian life is the way to be, they are the worst examples of how that is done. I think what they've done is set themselves up and, we're God's chosen few. So therefore we can do whatever we want and we just repent and say we're sorry and then we can get away with it. But I feel like if you look at what Christianity is supposed to be, they are the farthest thing from it.
Do you think that the fact that they do feel they have a superior version of Christianity and they do kind of sit on their high perch and look down at the rest of the world, do you think that's what makes it so hard for them to even entertain the idea that they have these problems? Because then that just makes them the same as everyone else. So if they downplay it, the first thing they'll say is, oh, well, this happens in other churches too. It's not just us. Well, of course it does. But you just spent decades of my life trying to convince me how much better you were than everyone else.
Right.
Why is that not translating into the way that you handle sexual impropriety, considering all we ever heard was modesty and lust and sex, no sex outside of marriage and none of this.
Right. Like the purity culture.
Yeah.
Dirtiest culture out there. Well, I look at even just their basic behaviors. I feel like yes, there are decent, honest people there. However, I still will never trust you because you are UPC. But I do feel like I saw more corruption there, just financial or, just people's behavior. I mean, in this whole process of going to court and going to trial, the things that were said to us as a group or myself individually, or other people who testified were horrendous. I mean, one person in their church sent us a video of basically shooting people, which we took as very threatening. Another person took videos of himself masturbating. Now, this is a person who was in the music ministry, who currently still is in the music ministry at Calvary Gospel Church, up on the pulpit, took videos of his genitals and videos of himself masturbating and sent it to a victim on the stand. Now, the DA did find out about that. And, some of it was brought up. Some of it, unfortunately, just didn't pertain to the trial. But I feel like, if you're claiming to be a superior Christian and you are God's chosen few, but that is what you do behind closed doors. And that's what I have a big beef with. Like, you're up there playing your guitar and singing in the music ministry and you look and you think you're something special. I wish so much that I could have 5 minutes behind that microphone at that church. Because, it would just five, just give me 5
I wish you could too.
I think that the other important thing to point out, and I did point this out to David Bernard and Lisa Reddy various times, is that young women within the church are punished very harshly when sexual impropriety takes place. So like, you are at risk of being kicked out of the school, of being kicked out of the choir, of being removed from all of your ministries, having people told to not associate with you. There is, the hammer comes down.
Absolutely.
On young women, and yet we're going to tiptoe around the sins of all of these men and not take the same kind of action. If you're going to remove a young woman from the school, then you should remove a pastor from his pulpit.
Right. And so and this is part of the problem, right? So you guys got your hides nailed to the barn door for lip gloss and clear fingernail polish and, every little thing that happened. So they had no mercy. There was no mercy to be found. But when John Grant gets reported for covering up multiple cases of sexual abuse, there is mercy everywhere to be had for him. And then, so I guess I'll kind of pull this into the final outcome. I mean, it's odd that you didn't get a letter, Rebecca, because it was literally the Glenn situation that they nailed John Grant.
Right.
That was the only thing he would admit to. And so
Yep.
it kind of bypassed the need for a trial. And he admitted to promoting Glenn into ministry for his license and stuff after he knew about this stuff. So all this mercy was reserved for their
The men.
own, which is why people don't trust them.
Well,
So
and-
I have, right, I have an interesting story, and I can't tell names because I was kind of told it in confidence, but there is a couple that I consider good friends of mine, the same couple that showed up to the sentencing. Their child has left UPC and was talking about the situation to their parents and said, you know, they're like, look at your granddaughter, who's exactly the same age at the time that they were having this conversation. Look at your granddaughter. What would you find out if the current pastor of the church was having a sexual relationship with your granddaughter? And I kid you not, this man who was on the board, I don't know if he still is, but he was considered, you know, if he's a minister, I believe he has his license.
An elder at the very least, right?
I was gonna say, I know he's kind of, you know, he's not just a layperson. He looked at his daughter and said, in reference to the granddaughter, you know, her example, saying, how would you feel if this was your granddaughter? And he said, she should have known better. Like, his answer was he would have blamed his 12-year-old granddaughter before he blamed the minister. And I feel like I cannot wrap especially as a parent, I cannot wrap my head around that. But there we go back to, yes, I guarantee the culture still exists.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk a little bit about the outcome.
Yes. I want to know how you guys felt about it. I'd like to know how you both felt when you read that letter.
So my thought was, okay, I feel like I had two ends of the spectrum. I was surprised that they did anything at all. I mean, just any acknowledgement I was a little bit surprised with, but I also did feel it was like a little bit of slap in the face. Like, we can't afford transcripts. We can't look at this. I felt like it was mamsy pamsy. You didn't really do anything. I mean, at one point in time, and when I was interviewed by those four gentlemen, I did say, I have a feeling that, you know, John Grant is old. You guys are going to basically wait until he passes away to wrap any of this up.
Yeah.
Because then you can say, well, we don't have to do anything with it anymore. Removing him from the Hall of Fame. I'd never even heard of the Hall of Fame until now. And I was UPC for years. You know, giving him like a suspension on his license or whatever. Again, I feel like it sounds good in theory. However, if he's not doing anything anymore, it's just it's again semantics. What I was more concerned with is like, is anyone going to let the congregation know? Because otherwise, if they send him a letter and be like, here, FYI, this is what we did to punish you, and nobody really knows about it, what good did it even do? You know, and I kind of waffle back and forth because I feel like, but I also kind of feel like having them do anything was a surprise. I was surprised that they even came down to talk with us. However, what they did do, I also kind of felt like, well, that was a slap that, you know, I was slapped harder than that when I wore nail polish in the Christian school than he was for this. But again, I also feel like they didn't look real hard. And even faced with the evidence, they refused to look. So what you know, I guess I also didn't really have any expectations set up for what I thought was going to happen because I didn't want that disappointment. I was kind of like, you know, I don't know where this is going to go. However, they met with me. I told my story. That was one more thing. I just wish I knew, like, who do they let know that this happened? Because I think that would maybe be that would probably be the only thing that they could do to maybe nip some of that behavior, make people think twice, maybe nip some of that behavior in the bud of, you know what, they did come after John Grant. So nobody is completely immune to any type of repercussions. However, if they don't notify the congregation, if they don't notify anyone else, if they don't put out a public statement, what does it matter if it's all done behind closed doors again?
I mean, that makes perfect sense. Like, if your bishop from your church is on probation for covering up sexual abuse cases, or I guess they really didn't even get him on that. They basically got him on promoting Glenn to ministry after he knew about it. But like, I would feel like as a congregant, you have the right to know.
You absolutely should know. But I also feel like
even if they did notify the pastor, I mean, what good's it going to do in that situation? Your son
going to notify the congregation?
Yeah, you think he's going to get up and read that?
Spill the dirt?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I felt like. I was like, gosh, there's got to be a way I can get that out there, but I've been blocked on everything.
One of the things that I was really upset about was that we were not allowed to see any of the information from the investigation. They provided John Grant with all of the information, but would not provide it to us. Now,
Yeah.
I went and sat with them and gave them a recorded interview and told them my whole entire story. But when I requested a copy of the investigation so that I would understand what had happened, they said it's not our policy to provide that to you.
Yeah.
I was kind of miffed that there wasn't more transparency. I felt like I kept asking, do you have any idea when this is going to wrap up? Can we see a copy of the investigation? And all the way along the line, what I was being told was that it's not within our procedure to do this.
Right.
So I felt like John Grant had all the information, but we did not have all the information, which was problematic to me. I felt like throughout the whole process that I was being finessed. I was being handled. I was being managed.
I had moments that I felt like I might be being handled right here. Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting. But in the end, they decided that they were going to give him a year of probation based on the fact that he promoted Glenn Uselman, knowing that he had committed these sins. But they wouldn't address anything to do with him covering up for Steve, in my case, or really any of the information they got from anyone else.
Right.
And the reason that I was given was, well, we don't want to drag you guys through a trial. We don't want to drag you through a trial. And there was some legitimacy behind that, because what was communicated to me from the survivor community is there's no way I'm going to go sit and have them cross-examine me.
Yeah.
Like, after everything that's happened, that doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel like it's worth what we all expected, which was nothing. And as a survivor, I'm not going to try to force anybody to do anything that they don't want to do. Like, that makes me uncomfortable. But I never said that I wouldn't go. Not to them. I mean, I kind of vacillated back and forth in my own mind about whether or not I would go. But I had a plan for what I was going to do if they asked me to go. I had a support person lined up. I had a plan. And they came back to me and they said, well, we're not going to do this. We're just going to get him on the thing we can get him on that he's confessed to. And we're not going to go to trial because we don't want to subject all of you to a trial. And it would be really traumatic. But out of the other side of their mouth, they were saying, we don't see any universe in which we're ever going to get anything more than this probation.
Right.
Even if we go to trial, we might not even get this. Which tells me that your district board is so corrupt that if I sit there and I tell them about what happened to me and how John Grant handled it, that their response is going to be, well, we don't really think that he's done anything wrong. And, I get that they don't have a lot of ethics in their policies regarding things like this.
Yes, their policies are pretty bare bones.
But they do remove pastors for things that I feel are less egregious. And so I felt like the whole narrative of, we don't want to put you through a trial, we don't want to whatever, and this is the best we can get, was really more about the fact that they didn't want to have a trial, have a bunch of survivors come in and give testimony, and then have to say full-throated, we've heard all of this and we're not going to do anything. There are some things that I don't really feel comfortable talking about who I had the conversation with, but I was told that part of the reluctance for on their part for not wanting to take his license is pension. That he could lose pension, he could lose benefits. And so they were more concerned about that. And, the narrative has always been from the very beginning, this happened decades ago.
30 to 40 years ago.
And he's an old man and he doesn't have any power anymore. Therefore, you don't need to be worried about this. And my argument is, in what other criminal situation would the fact that someone was elderly come into play about whether or not they would be held accountable? I really struggled because I felt like when I got the letter, there were people around me that were like, well, this is really amazing. Like they did something, like I didn't expect that they were going to do anything.
Yeah.
But for me, in my own personal situation, I felt completely disregarded.
Right. You had kind of been the go-to person, and your story was like at the forefront of this whole thing. And then all it ends up being is Glenn Usselman got his preacher's license and shouldn't have. And so, like, for me, I don't want to get too far into how I felt about it because I'm going to just make a separate video and give my opinion about it. But like, yeah, it felt like he sinned against the UPC, not all the sins he committed against everybody all along that left a wake of destruction. And so that was what they punished. And it did come across that way.
They were upset that he broke one of their rules.
Yes.
And that's what they were willing to mete out. A very mild.
And that's what he confessed to and apologized for. I feel like he probably has no respect whatsoever for you ladies. None, but he has respect for the UPC. And so he would confess to and apologize for any kind of offense he committed to them because he has respect for them.
Right. One thing I did hear repeatedly during the process was that John Grant didn't actually molest anyone himself.
Right. So he wasn't a predator. He just enabled several predators.
And, the thing that I keep coming back to is when I was a girl and I went to Pastor Grant, I went to him because he was the highest authority in my life.
Yes.
He was my pastor. There wasn't anyone who was higher in authority in my life than the person who was my pastor, my district superintendent, my principal at my school. I wouldn't have known how to even contact the police if I had wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And also we were taught that contacting the police was a bad thing because you should never bring the police into the church. So right. I went to the highest authority in my life and I told him things that no 12 or 13-year-old girl wants to tell a man about what had happened to me. He tape recorded me.
Yeah.
And there was no one else present. There wasn't a woman in the room. It was just me and him. I entrusted him with my story because he was my highest authority, but also because he was supposed to be my shepherd. Right. And immediately after I told him, every single prominent adult in my life in the church stopped talking to me. So I was completely an island.
Yeah. He made sure you were isolated.
Yeah, he made sure that I was isolated. And, to me, it's very hard for me to have a lot of compassion for him.
Yeah. Because
he didn't have any compassion for me. And then when I see the stories of all of the other survivors, and it's the same pattern repeated over and over and over again, we're going to sacrifice the girl and elevate the man, or at the very least allow him to stay in his position or where he is. And he did that over and over and over again. And it's like, how many young girls need to be driven out of the church before what he has done rises to the level of actually having done it himself? And what does it say about him as a man and as a pastor that he would allow all of these things to happen.
I don't understand it.
Because to me, you know, the argument is, well, he didn't do any of these things himself. But I do have to bring into question, like, what kind of person just watches this happen and doesn't do anything about it?
Yeah.
And so all the way along in the process, they're like, well, he's old. Well, we need to have compassion. Well, this, well, that. And, you know, I've asked them, how do they square not punishing him really and not and expecting me to show him all this compassion? How do they square that against almost an entire generation of girls gone from that congregation? And I did push back on them. I said, isn't your creed or your motto the whole gospel to the whole world?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you don't really care about my salvation or the salvation of any of these young women that were driven out of the church. No one wants to talk to me about that.
After this whole entire process was over with, and we found out that John Grant got a year's probation where he can't preach or teach anywhere in the UPC, which means absolutely nothing because he's not preaching and teaching anyway. He's 100 years old and feeble and sits up on his little throne on the platform when he goes to church. And like, you know, there's really, he's not active in the church because
not in front of the saints.
No. And so and then he was removed from the Order of the Faith, and that was immediate. Like the second you guys got a letter, he was removed. I actually was impressed by that because my expectations were pretty low. So after that happened, like was like within that week, wasn't it, Debbie?
Yeah, it was pretty quick.
That David Bernard made himself available to meet with the survivor community. And I kind of volunteered to, you know, if they wanted me to, if anybody thought it would make people more comfortable, that I said I would attend the meeting as well as sort of a buffer so that it's not just survivors on the one side and like David Bernard and Lisa Reddy, you know, UPC ministers on the other side, which, you know, could be intimidating. And so they were both open to that. And so we did that, and that already happened. It's in the past as well. And so the survivor community, anyone who participated in this situation was invited. The main reason that David Bernard did it, I think, was because we had initially reached out to him and he had spoken with you and I before the actual official judicial process started. And so he just basically made himself available. So if anybody had anything that they wanted to say to him, and I do think that the tone of the letter was so formal and so, dare I say, heartless. I do think that there was an element there where he kind of wanted an opportunity to make it a little more personal, maybe, would you say? Because the letter was pretty, like I said, formal. So we had that Zoom meeting. Debbie was the only survivor who actually attended. So it was just the four of us, me and Debbie and David Bernard and Lisa Reddy. Talk about that. Talk about how you felt that meeting went.
I didn't really go into the meeting. Well, first of all, I did make an attempt to try to talk to some of the other survivors to see if they would participate. They mostly felt like it was a waste of time and they don't really trust David Bernard. So at this point, I was like so exhausted from the process that I wasn't really in a place where I was going to really be trying to corral. I just kind of put it out there. You know, this is happening. You can come if you would like.
Mm-hmm.
Been invited. I more so attended this meeting out of a sense of generosity to give David Bernard an opportunity to say whatever he wanted to say. I wasn't going into it with like super high expectations that he was going to make me feel better about the process or about the outcome or anything like that. That being said, I mean, I was very impressed by his one-on-one sort of interaction with me.
Mhm.
He showed compassion.
Yeah.
He seemed to care very deeply about wanting to walk away from this interaction with things being okay between him and I personally. And that was more than what I was expecting. I don't really know what I thought was going to happen from this whole Zoom call that we did with him. I go back and forth. Sometimes I am able to feel a lot of compassion for his position and for what he is going through and trying to navigate the situation that's unfolding across the UPCI. Then there are other days when I feel like he should step down and make a statement, that he's not going to be
Step down as the general superintendent.
I think that he should leave.
But here's my question, and you and I disagree on this.
do.
We've disagreed in the past. We actually very strongly disagree. What do you think would happen if he stepped down? Like, who do you think would take his place, and how much more unsafe do you think the UPC would be? Like, this is my take on it. Like, I disagree with David Bernard on so many doctrinal points, but when it comes to this issue of the sexual abuse and trying to make changes and stuff, I do feel like he is trying, like he sees the need for some change. I don't know that anyone who preceded him felt the same way about this issue. And so here's my question. If he has a moment where he's like, okay, I don't want to be a part of an organization that is maybe resisting some of this change, and I'm going to just step down and I'm going to just go and minister maybe independently or on my own or whatever, it creates a vacuum. And who do you think is going to end up taking his place? And do you think the UPC will be worse or better for it?
Well, the issue is that, yes, I mean, he is trying to create change and he is in a position of authority, but the problem is he can't create the change that he wants, because if he does, they'll remove him from office. So, like, is he even going to be able to do any of the things that he wants to do? And even though I am not UPC anymore, I care about people, I care about their mental health, and I care about his spirituality as it pertains to him as a human and how he feels about himself. And I have to ask myself, like, what is it doing to his soul to remain walking this line? And what would Jesus say about this? What did Jesus do, like with the money changers? He went in and he turned over the tables, and like he wasn't gentle about it. He wasn't soft about it. And I feel like if David Bernard made a public statement and said, I've been trying to create change in this way, the church is corrupt in this way, they're not willing to make the changes. If he was willing to come forward and make a statement like that, if Lisa Reddy was willing to come forward and say, I've been doing this work, this is what I've witnessed. This is what I've witnessed from all of these state district boards. This is the attitude of these men in power, and I will no longer support it. I think that could make a really big statement. But I feel like they're more concerned about retaining power and staying in their positions and staying where they're comfortable.
Do you think there's an element of it where they do on the ground see some things starting to change and they're encouraged enough by that to feel like what they're doing is working? You don't think so?
I think that as long as you have to play by the rules of a corrupt organization in order to stay in power, in order to enact the changes that you want to enact, you're never going to be able to enact your changes. So like, if David Bernard had real power and could wield it in such a way that he could make sweeping changes to the organization. That would be one thing. But what I'm hearing is, well, I can't do this and I can't do this and I can't do this and I can't do this.
But don't you think it makes sense that the structure is set up so that there isn't one cult leader at the top wielding all the power and making sweeping changes? Because I mean, maybe David Bernard's a nice man and he would be careful with the changes he made. But I mean, I can think of some of the previous general superintendents that had they had full power, I'd hate to think.
Well, here's what I would say then, if that's, and I agree with you. I agree with you. Like, I don't really actually see a winning situation here, which is why I think you should leave. I have a really hard time with this. I really feel like there's actually no way that those that are trying to reform are actually going to be able to reform.
But if David Bernard were to leave the UPC because he just felt like the policy didn't support what he felt was the most godly way of being and supporting victims and stuff, do you honestly think that there is another Christian group out there? Like you were saying, there are other oneness groups. Do you think any of them are set up any better? I mean, I know I've had people ask me, well, do you think sexual abuse issues and stuff are more prevalent in the UPC? I actually don't. I think they're prevalent everywhere. I think the spiritual abuse problem is more prevalent in the UPC than other places, just because of the way they look at spiritual leadership and stuff like that. And it probably does spill over into how they handle the sexual abuse things. But I mean, if he were to just leave because the policies aren't good enough, where would he go that they were?
Well, okay, two things. First of all, I think that
look at us just discussing what David Bernard needs to do with his career.
I think that sexual abuse, especially of minors, is rampant in any organization where women don't have equality. So because there is this teaching of submission and there is this teaching of holiness and women covering up and
extreme modesty culture,
being responsible for men falling into sin and all of that kind of stuff, I think that wherever you find that, you're going to find this kind of behavior. I don't believe that all churches actually have that problem. Like, I think there are churches that believe that women are just as valuable as men, that, you know, when sin happens, it's not just because of something that the woman did. I do believe that there are places that you can find that are more forward thinking about those sorts of things.
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair, like you say, there are churches, but to be fair, there are UPC churches who feel that way too. Like within the broader culture, there are UPC churches that are more forward thinking, they're more laid back, the ministers are more laid back, you know, they have females in positions of leadership and they esteem them highly and respect them as well. So, I mean, I do think...
Well, I think it's a matter of, like, if you're looking at something from an organization-wide perspective, or if you're looking at like individual churches within an organization. You know, I think the question keeps coming up of like, well, what should David Bernard do? I don't know. I mean, I'm not concerned about his position. I'm not concerned about his profession. I'm concerned about his soul. You know, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus be concerned about where he's going to go? No, he would. I believe that he would say this is wrong and this is sin and I'm not going to be a part of it. If you're not going to come to repentance, you know, I just don't believe that he would just sort of stand by and say, well, I'm doing everything I can without jeopardizing my position. I just don't believe that. Like, I get it. I get the question of like, where would he go? I don't know. You don't have to go to church, in my view.
No, I agree with that.
So like, what does it matter? I personally would have a very difficult time remaining a member of an organization that I felt like had this kind of a problem and wasn't addressing it in a more full-throated way.
But I guess, and like I said, this is an area where Debbie and I disagree. You know, you've seen some back and forth here. I feel like David Bernard is in a position where he doesn't. It's kind of like the president can't just make up new laws and change laws and stuff. Everything goes through a voting process. There are checks and balances in place to keep everything safe. I feel like David Bernard is in the same position, and I do think, and I mean, I say this as someone who, again, I disagree with him on so much, but I do feel like he ends up bearing the brunt of every grievance that everybody has with the organization, when in reality, he only has the authority to do so much. Like, he can't.
Unfortunately, that's part of the job, though.
It is.
I mean, you can't get up at general conference and take all the applause and get to speak to everyone and get to be held up in this position of high esteem, and then not also have to bear the brunt of people's views about the church in general. I mean, it's part of the responsibility of the job. It's unfortunate.
I agree.
Like, I feel like he needs to be more vocal, more upfront with his feelings. But
yeah,
again, he can't even do that, right? Because if he does, he might lose his position. So, like, if the best you can do is just like bite around the edges, like, how long are you willing to do that, before you decide that this is not?
Yeah. And your feeling is, if that's all you're going to do, go find something else to do. And my feeling is, I mean, it's something. Like, that's where we differ.
Well, but see, people have been telling me that my whole life.
Right.
Well, at least this, at least that.
Yeah, I get
at
that.
least you're not in the church anymore,
Mhm.
Blah, blah, blah. From my perspective, as someone who survived sexual assault and watched my abuser be embraced by the church and allowed him to be in fellowship with the UPC kind of on the down low, right? Because they don't want anyone to know. But like, watching that happen and all the things that I went through in my childhood, from my perspective, the UPCI is a life ruiner. I have seen, so like, I don't have an education right now because of the UPCI, because of the school that I went to, because of the substandard education that I was given as a kid. And there are a lot of ways that it has affected my life, and it has affected other survivors' lives that continue on past when you leave. And so my views about David Bernard and my views about Lisa Reddy are probably harsher than yours, because
absolutely,
my experience is harsher.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I get that we're coming from a different place, and I completely respect the place that you're coming from, and I understand how you would feel the way that you do. I do. I just want to make that clear. Like, people, just for people watching, Debbie and I, we talk all the time anyway, so we know like where we stand. But
right. I also think too, though, like, I come from Madison, Wisconsin, right? I come from the Madison church. That is a completely different experience than what many people experience.
Yeah, definitely different than the church I grew up in. There were issues, but I feel like my church would have never tolerated what went on in your church. Like, that was, I do feel like the Madison church was an extreme version, but I don't think it's so extreme that this kind of thing doesn't happen anywhere else. But I just think there was a lot there.
And I think, though, too, that it's important to point out that Madison may be by degrees worse than other churches. But the important thing to remember about the Wisconsin district is that Pastor Grant was a superintendent for a very long time. And so his leadership was felt all over the state. And I have spoken to survivors who were from different churches whose pastors handled things exactly the same way that John Grant did, probably because they got advice from him and they were under his leadership. So it had an impact outside of the Madison church.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm glad that you joined me today to share your thoughts on the process, because again, as a survivor, your perspective is different from mine. And I think that it's important to hear that. And so I appreciate you sharing all of the craziness that went on over the last, what, 8, 9 months, 10 months, whatever it was. And
I'm looking forward to a break after going through the trial year and this. I'm just kind of like, okay, can we not for a little while?
Let's
but I do want to say that if people want to contact me, they can reach me at survivingchurchandchildhood@gmail.com.
Yes.
And I'm always willing to help in any way that I can. You know, I want to be a resource. If anyone wants to ask me about my experience with the judicial procedure or anything like that, feel free to reach out.
And now you and I think, are both ready to focus on something a lot lighter and more fun, like fall decorating and
Apple picking.
apple picking. Yes, all of the harvest type things. That's a common ground we have. So let's think about that for a bit. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, you can hit like and share. And if you would like for YouTube to notify you when I make a new one, you can hit subscribe and the little notification bell and
Ring the bell.
Ring the bell. So thank you so much, Debbie.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a great day.